my fellow small business supporters, I'm Savvy, and welcome back to Savvy Writes Books, where today we are going to be going into part 3 of the Deep Dave on Dave Ramsey. If you're new to this channel, the Deep Dave series is a series where we dive deep into guys named Dave, dive deep into the buttholes of buttholes named Dave, and Dave Ramsey is definitely a butthole, as we are going to talk about today, when Dave Ramsey is getting sued by multiple of his former employees for various things, including discrimination against a pregnant woman. Now, as we go through today's video talking about the lawsuits, I want you to keep two things in mind. First of all, nothing in this video whatsoever is intended to be legal advice. Everything in this video is meant to be a discussion based on opinions. I want you to make sure that if you ever need actual legal advice for a specific situation, find a specific lawyer for you and talk to that lawyer about your specific circumstances. This video is just a discussion about speculation and opinions and analysis. Second of all, as you guys may know, I personally am not a lawyer. As they would say on the legal advice subreddit, I anal stands for I am not a lawyer, which is true. I am not a lawyer. However, I decided that for this video, to really delve deep into the nuances of these lawsuits and to get into the meat of what's really going on, it would be beneficial if I interviewed a lawyer and talked to someone who actually understands the intricacies of law and how that works. So I decided to interview a lawyer that many of you guys have recommended to me, and you didn't even need to recommend her because I was already a fan of her channel, and that is Emily D. Baker, who is a very popular law channel here on YouTube. So in just a few minutes, I am going to go into the interview that I did with Emily, where the two of us are discussing Dave's lawsuits in depth, and she is going to talk a little bit about what the law and what Tennessee law specifically says about this. I'm very fortunate to have interviewed Emily because she is actually in Tennessee, where Dave's company is located. So, you know, laws vary a lot in the US state by state, so I was very lucky that I got to speak to someone who actually lives in the state where this is taking place right now. So I hope you guys enjoy that. Please stick around. We're going to have a really fun and informative video for you guys today.
Dave!
From the standpoint of, ooh, you will not go unpunished.
You guys asked for it.
Hey everyone! Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new, welcome for the first time. This is Savvy Writes Books, the channel where we talk about books and business, and this is episode 3 of the Dave Ramsey edition of Deep Daves. Parts 1 and 2 will be linked in the description below. You can also check out my full Deep Daves playlist, linked up in the cards, where I have my Deep Dave sections on Dave Hollis as well, where I did a really in-depth review of his book and tore that apart, and did a video where Chewy and I wrote a parody book, which should now be available on Patreon. If you're one of my Patreon supporters and you haven't received the parody book as a reward yet, please let me know. I'm hoping that by next week I can get it listed on Amazon for everyone else, so just stay tuned for that. While I have you here, and before we go into everything, please don't forget to subscribe to my second channel, which is called Your Morning Guru. If you enjoy some of my deep dives on these shady business gurus, then you're gonna love the podcast and live stream channel that I have with my friend RK Gold called Your Morning Guru, where every morning at 8 a.m. Central, we live stream delving into the lives of various business gurus, including scammers and sometimes legitimate business gurus, sometimes people who are helpful to us. We see what we can learn, to do and not to do. So it's a really fun time, and it's very interactive. We're always interacting with the chat and having a fun conversation with the entire community. So that is linked in the description below. Please join us there. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Dave Ramsey's lawsuits. If you need a brief overview, I highly recommend watching part 1 of this video, where I went in an overview through all of the lawsuits that he's going through right now, especially the big one where he is in trouble for firing a pregnant woman and saying, well, I'm not firing her because she's pregnant, I'm firing her because she's pregnant and not married, which means she had sex outside of marriage, which goes against our righteous living policy. It's a whole mess, but thankfully, I had Emily here to help piece together what kind of legal stuff we can take out of this whole hot mess. So let's get into that. All right, so y'all, I'm here with Emily D. Baker. A lot of you guys who watch me probably watch her as well. From what I've seen, our audiences actually have a lot of crossover, so you've probably seen her videos already, but if you haven't, she is a lawyer here on YouTube, and she makes law-related YouTube content. So you want to, say hi, introduce yourself a little bit? Yeah.
Hey there, I am Emily D. Baker. I am a legal commentator that loves the pop culture side of legal commentary. I've been an attorney for over 15 years. I was a deputy district attorney in the county of Los Angeles for over 10 years, so I did prosecutorial work. And then I moved into the entrepreneur sphere and worked with online and small business owners, which is where I think a lot of our crossover came from when I found your channel, because a lot of the things I was interested in and seeing in that space are things that you also cover. And then as my content shifted into just legal commentary, there's still crossover with the people that we both like to cover. So I do legal commentary for everybody so that we can all understand the legal stuff that governs our lives. I don't think the laws that we have to abide by should be gate kept behind hundreds of thousands of dollars of education.
Yeah, especially, I try to read a legal document. I'm like, something in here's trying to trick me and I know it, but I don't know what it is. And like we were saying earlier, I did a video in the past about the lawsuit that happened when Rachel and Dave and the Hollis Company got sued for the Made for More trademark infringement. Yep. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, well, this is like plagiarism and this is bad. But I didn't know what happened from the legal side of that. So I actually interviewed one of my friends for that, who is an intellectual property lawyer.
Fantastic.
And that was fun, but he's not like a social media guy, so he didn't appear on camera, but I just kind of summarized what he said. But that was a good thing for that. And so I'm excited to talk to you about this because you've worked with like small businesses and with like kind of the business ownership side of law. And here we are talking about Dave Ramsey, who has just been given a couple of lawsuits by some of his former employees for the ways that he treated them as an employer. And so I really want to get some of your takes on this. So I guess let's start with the big one. I mean, there's two lawsuits going on right now, but there's one that has kind of got everyone really talking, and that is the one about how Dave fired a pregnant woman. He was saying, well, I didn't technically fire her for being pregnant. I fired her for being pregnant and unmarried, and try to say that's a loophole. So my uneducated, not lawyer perspective was looking this up and seeing, okay, well, Tennessee's an at-will employment state, so I don't know how that factors in. However, pregnancy is still a protected class, so I don't know how that factors in. I don't know if his defense of like, but she wasn't married, it matters at all. I guess from what you've seen about this case and your perspective as a lawyer, what do you think this is going to happen in this case, or what do you think the real important stuff to look at here is?
It's an interesting case that Caitlin O'Connor filed against Ramsey Solutions and the Lampo Group. I'm just going to break down what she's alleging in her third amended complaint, because a lot of litigation has happened to get to this point. And because of that, we've gotten some more information, because there have been discovery motions where we've gotten a little more information from what both sides' perspective is. But she was unmarried in a committed long-term relationship based on everything that's been said in the legal filings. Again, this is all based on public record documents that are legal filings that are my interpretation. But you can say a lot of stuff in legal filings, and we'll get into that. But this has a lot of like this email. These are really well-written documents. The lawyers on both sides have made this very clear. And it's a lot of this email on this date said this, and this email from them on this date said this. Those are pretty easy things to prove. The email said it or it didn't. It's not a lot of outside of those emails things. It's all stuff that's going to be well documented. It's just going to be whether the Ramsey Solutions defense of, we didn't fire her because she's pregnant, because that's a protected class under disability. We fired her for having premarital sex, and we have fired others for having premarital sex, and we've fired others for having extramarital sex. So now they are regulating the sex lives, or seeking to regulate the sex lives of their employees, which I think hits everybody a little creepy. And whether that's legal or not is going to be very interesting.
Like, just because it's creepy doesn't mean it's illegal or something. And I think that
morality and legality can be two very different things. And you might be like, this feels wrong, might still be legal, even though it feels totally weird. So she's suing for violation of Family Medical Leave Act for retaliation and interference, because she asked for her medical leave documentation and information, and they fired her as she was asking for those accommodations. Violation of the THRA, which is Tennessee's Health Rights Act, for sex and pregnancy discrimination, arguing essentially that, well, premarital sex is easier to determine if you're a woman who gets pregnant. So this might be a sex-based discrimination versus a male employee. It's a little harder to determine if they have been engaging in premarital sex.
Right.
I don't know how you would quantify that. For a pregnant woman, it's a little easier to be like, well,
Yeah.
we have some reason to suspect. Violation of the Tennessee Maternity Leave Act, violation of the Tennessee Disability Act, violation of the Title VII religious discrimination, which is a very interesting argument. And they're kind of fighting that one a lot in some of these filings. Violation of Title VII sex and pregnancy disability. And those are the, civil rights protected class sections. Violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then is asking for judgment that the righteous living policy as a whole violates Title VII, back pay and damages, reinstatement of the position or pay going forward for a period of time, damages for embarrassment, humiliation, stress, anxiety, and loss of enjoyment of life, punitive damages, which are the punishment ones like, hey, you suck, give us more money, liquidated damages under FMLA, which is statutory, like you get this much money, then attorney's fees and expenses and interest. So that's generally what she's asking for, saying, I was terminated because of my gender or because I was pregnant. And Ramsey's solution saying, no, we fire everyone who has premarital sex. And their arguments are there have been 7 employees that this has come up with, and they've fired all of them. And 5 of them were men. So their argument is this is not gender-based.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up, was that on Ramsey's side, I had interviewed one of his former employees recently, and she had brought up that she knew a man who had gotten fired because he lived with his fiance before the two of them were married. And Ramsey said, you don't live together before marriage. And he fired that person even though he's a man. So I think in that sense, he probably could have something to say like, hey, there's no proof that this is sex-based discrimination because we did this to a man too. However, another thing that people are bringing up on the other side that I also want to talk about is Chris Hogan, his co-host. So Dave Ramsey's co-host on his radio show is Chris Hogan, right? And a big thing that Chris Hogan had recently left the company, but for a long time now, Dave Ramsey had known that Chris was engaging in extramarital affairs, including with other women at their workplace. Now, something really important that we need to discuss if we're going to talk about the whole double standards argument in this particular lawsuit is Chris Hogan, another employee at Dave Ramsey's company. A lot of people brought Chris Hogan up when we were looking at part 1, and I said, y'all, we're going to talk about him in part 3. Chris Hogan was one of Dave Ramsey's former employees. He was very high up in the company, and on Dave Ramsey's radio show, or if you watch the video versions, you probably saw or heard him as the main co-host that would always work with Dave and talk with him on those shows. However, just a couple of months ago, Chris Hogan announced that he was leaving Ramsey Solutions, but not until after a great deal of controversy. So let's talk about Chris Hogan. So we're back on Religion News Service to briefly discuss Chris Hogan. I have 2 articles about him that I want to go over with you guys real quick, and then we will go back into the interview and law discussion to continue that. So this article is called Chris Hogan, Retirement Expert and Dave Ramsey Protege, Departs Ramsey Solutions. The company owned by Christian financial guru and radio show host Dave Ramsey has lost one of its best-known personalities. Chris Hogan, once viewed as a successor to Ramsey, announced in a video on Wednesday, March 10th that he was no longer with the company. Recently, it's come to light that I've done some things personally that are not in line with Ramsey Solutions, and as a result, I'm no longer a team member at Ramsey, Hogan said in the brief video. I'm sorry for the harm that this has caused. The company said it was deeply disappointed in what it called Hogan's recent admissions. This week, new information came to light that Chris Hogan has recently done some things personally that are not in line with Ramsey Solutions' core values, the company said in a statement. As a result of his current actions and behavior, Chris Hogan is no longer a team member at Ramsey or a Ramsey personality. Hogan, author of Everyday Millionaires, hosted his own popular radio show on Ramsey's platform, as well as appearing as a frequent guest host on Dave Ramsey's program. A familiar presence at Ramsey Solutions events, Hogan was featured in a Reset event that Ramsey Solutions livestreamed from Life Church, one of the largest congregations in the United States. The company's website described him as America's leading voice on retirement, investing, and building wealth. Hogan had also previously been a source of controversy at the company, which employs about 1,000 people at its headquarters just south of Nashville. Ramsey Solutions prides itself on being the, quote, best place to work in America. Watch part 1 if you need to see why that's not true. And requires employees to adhere to a strict, quote, righteous living code that bans gossip and sex outside of marriage. The company is being sued for firing a pregnant employee who was unmarried. Now, this is what we need to keep in mind here, right? Because this employee who was pregnant and unmarried was fired, being told that the reason was that she had sex outside of marriage and that violates their policy. But let's talk about what Chris Hogan did real quick. Ramsey himself has been outspoken in defending the company's culture, which he has described as godly, not cult-like at all, okay. Don't talk to me about how you love your pastor and your church and I just moved in with my boyfriend, he told employees in 2020 after news of the lawsuit broke. That's so freaking inconsistent and stupid. Anyone who disagreed with company policy should leave, he says, because the company would not sanction misbehavior. And if you don't like that, this is your cue, he said in a recording obtained by Religion News Service. Don't let the door hit you in the ass. Hogan, however, had admitted to having several affairs, including one with a fellow Ramsey employee, during his divorce proceedings without apparent discipline from company leadership. So this is where we start to see some of that double standard, right? That Chris Hogan had been having extramarital affairs. So was he married while having sex? Yes. But he was having sex with women who were not his wife. Therefore, he too was having sex outside of marriage. So that's where we get a little into the semantics of this. And we're going to go back and have Emily talk about her legal interpretation of this as well in just a second. Instead, after company officials became aware of Hogan's infidelity in 2018, 3 years, guys. So they were aware that he was having extramarital affairs for 3 years, 2018, and he didn't leave until 2021. There's a long period there. So this was just before the launch of Everyday Millionaires. The company put together a restoration plan that would allow Hogan's book tour to go forward. Parts of that plan included mandatory counseling for Hogan and his then spouse Melissa, and a request that the counselor and the couple's pastor send regular reports to Ramsey and other company leaders. Okay, let's talk about this real quick. So in part 1, and also in this video a little, we've been talking about how Dave Ramsey really loves to insert himself into his employees' personal lives. Am I going to condone an extramarital affair that your spouse did not consent to? Absolutely not, because that is not, you should have a trusting relationship with your partner, right? I think what Chris Hogan did was horrible. However, we see Dave here saying, okay, well, I want to see your marriage counseling sessions. I want to see reports from them. I want to get that behind the scenes stuff. That is creepy and weird on Dave's part. Additionally, let's look at the fact that Everyday Millionaires had not yet launched when Dave found out about the infidelity. So when he knew that Chris Hogan was having an extramarital affair, was having sex outside of his marriage, sex outside of marriage, same thing that this woman who was fired while pregnant was apparently fired for, Dave still went ahead and launched the Everyday Millionaires thing. Why? My guess would be money, right? Money. Because Chris Hogan had the ability to bring in all of this money. He was a well-known and well-liked personality. He was towards the top of the company. Guys, it's the privilege of being at the top. That's what always gets you ahead. Dave definitely, from what I'm seeing here, doesn't look like he treated his upper level and lower level employees the same. Now, whether she's going to be able to use that as sex-based discrimination is remaining to be seen, because while he treated Chris Hogan differently than he treated her, there is also evidence that he's treated male employees the same way he's treated her when they weren't as high of a level as Chris Hogan. So this seems to almost be rank-based discrimination instead of gender, which is not a protected class in that case. So interesting topic here. So let's continue with this though. After Melissa Hogan objected to that plan and the couple separated, Ramsey told employees that the couple was going through a really nasty divorce and accused Melissa Hogan of making angry and untrue allegations about her then husband. Dave's not misogynistic at all, guys. When RNS reported on concerns about Hogan and the culture at Ramsey Solutions, the company ridiculed any allegations against Hogan. Hogan did not respond to a request for comment. Melissa Hogan released a statement saying that her ex-husband's video offers no specific apology to her or other people he harmed. She also said the apology did not address the way she was treated by the company. I note that while his statement generically expresses being sorry for harm, he does not take responsibility for the impact of his actions or on his family, people who trusted him, or people whose jobs depended on his role and his integrity, she said. Melissa Hogan, who detailed her concerns about the company earlier this year, also said Ramsey Solutions has long been aware her ex-husband's conduct was not compatible with the company's values and could have taken action in the past. Instead, they chose to manipulate, cover up, and intimidate, she said. Manipulate, cover up, intimidate, gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. That's Dave. Dave Ramsey's a girl boss, y'all. Chris Hogan's departure comes at a time when the discrimination lawsuit filed against Ramsey Solutions is heating up. Attorneys for former Ramsey Solutions employee Caitlin O'Connor, who lost her job after telling her boss she was pregnant, have asked for details about other employees fired for violating the company's moral code. Those attorneys have asked for Chris Hogan's personnel file, according to court documents. Ramsey Solutions has claimed in court that O'Connor was fired for premarital sex and not for being unmarried and pregnant. The company also claims it has fired 8 employees, both men and women, in the past 5 years for violating its ban on premarital sex. The two sides are in dispute over how much information Ramsey Solutions must provide during discovery. So it's like, okay, is the policy against premarital sex or any sex outside of your marriage? So having affairs, is that okay? From what it seems, the policy was never specific in the first place. So, and we're going to talk about that. So that's some of the background, just for some information on what happened with Chris Hogan. Now we're going to head back into the interview and talk about some more law-related stuff.
But
Very
he let him
invasive.
keep his job until recently when Chris Hogan finally left, but he was allowed to keep his job for a really long time. So do you think that's going to come into play at all in this court case?
It may. We're already seeing the arguments in a discovery motion where the plaintiff here, Caitlin, is the plaintiff being the person suing, is seeking more information about others terminated under the righteous living policies and under this code of conduct. And they've included 2 individuals fired for extramarital sex, but are arguing, look, at trial, under case law, the only other employees we can compare to are employees like for like terminated. So
Gotcha.
terminated for the premarital sex. So they're trying to distinguish premarital sex and extramarital sex. This is all very weird to talk about when it comes to an employer.
Weird. It's like, are there, I mean, this is outside my knowledge, but are there any places that have laws that protect people from being invasive in their employees' sex lives or anything like that? Or is that kind of just not a thing that's really addressed at all?
I mean, it's addressed generally through you can't discriminate based on sexual orientation was one of the big ones that took way too long to get shifted that you couldn't be invasive regard to sexual orientation and get terminated for that. But if it's not a protected class, we're seeing people complain about this with ideology right now too. And we're seeing lawsuits over, oh, well, I've been terminated because my ideology is this. It's not a protected class, so it becomes very hard to show that the policy is discriminatory because employers are allowed to make policies that are non-discriminatory, even though we think it's super fucking weird.
Yeah, exactly.
She's arguing that her religious beliefs, so she's saying now it's religious in her third amended complaint, it's also religious discrimination. She's saying my sincerely held religious beliefs of being a Christian doesn't discriminate against people for having premarital sex. I don't believe that's a tenet of Christianity. So it's bonkers to me that you are terminating me for this. And I think it's kind of a ruse and you're really terminating me for being pregnant, which is protected and you can't do. Because the righteous living policy says, essentially, we believe character matters, but it doesn't lay out what it is. The problem for the plaintiff is going to be her email to, and let me just quote it so it's easier. Her email to HR laid out that she understood this was a problem. So her email to HR that's quoted in the lawsuit said, I need to let you know I'm 12 weeks pregnant. I understand that being unmarried and expecting is frowned on here. So she's acknowledging that she's aware that this could be a situation in the workplace. And I know in your interview with a former employee, they were talking about, you know, men and women traveling in cars together and things like that. While it might not be what we agree with, employers are allowed to say, we've got some boundaries of who we work with. We are a Christian-based company. This is our view of Christianity. She's arguing, this is not my view of Christianity. Therefore, you're discriminating against my religious beliefs, because in my religious beliefs, I can be unmarried because procreation is a right of women given by God, and I'm in a committed relationship, and a contract or a marital contract doesn't change that God-given right. And so her arguments have leaned with regards to that religious discrimination in that direction of saying, your view of Christianity and my view of Christianity aren't squaring here, and you're discriminating against me for my view. And that's going to be a very interesting head-to-head as well with, is this religious discrimination, failure to accommodate? It is an at-will work state, and that will play in because a workplace is allowed to set rules for their employees and say, this is our company values. It's less weird when we talk about things that are easier for most people to understand if you're talking about non-protected classes, but you don't want people getting fired necessarily for off-work behavior. But you also don't want companies to be forced to keep somebody who engages in off-work behavior that blows back on the company, like Amy Cooper in Central Park, the Central Park Karen.
Yeah.
She's suing her employer for firing her as well for off-work behavior. And her company's like, no. What we're not going to do is let you go wild, engage in what we perceive to be as racist behavior, and have it reflect badly on the company and then not fire you.
Yeah.
We're allowed to make that choice. So these are two sides of the same coin, really, of off-work behavior not aligning with a company values and somebody being terminated for it. And we're going to keep seeing law trying to blend this line of where is off-work behavior and your work life, where does the inquiry stop? And social media has really blurred that line for the plaintiff in this case. The obvious status of pregnancy has blurred that line, but for most, it's going to be social media that's blurring the on-duty, off-duty lines of work.
On the one hand, it seems like, yeah, that makes sense. But on the other hand, then, okay, when does the protection come in when an employer says, okay, so now the precedent is set that I can determine in their personal life people want to act which way? It's like, it would be too invasive then to categorize that and be like, well, you can fire someone for acting this way in their personal life, but not for acting this way in their personal life, because then that's going to get really weird into going into the like minute details of people's lives. So it almost seems like, what is even the solution here? Is there one?
I think it's something the law is going to continue to evaluate as we continue to get into lawsuits like this to figure out where I feel like the wheels are off with social media and employment anyway, because companies, even the FTC, companies can get blowback from what their employees say on social media if it's considered false advertising. And I think we're going to see this hit the MLM world pretty hard. It's already started to, but so what you do on social media can impact your company negatively. Companies, you can always trust to act in their own best interest of their bottom line, even if their morals and values are performative covers for them acting in their own best interest of their bottom line. But where employees have to behave is knowing their workplace, and I think workplaces have to be very upfront. There's no argument that Ramsey Solutions and Lampo Group is very upfront about what they believe to be their values and what they expect their employees to adhere to. And I think it's made very clear to employees, and that's going to, even though it's wild to talk about employees getting fired for having sex as adults, and consenting adults, it's still within this gray zone of being sexually active is not a protected class. So how do you say if they're firing both men and women for the same thing that it's discriminatory? And that's going to be their argument. She's going to argue, one, it goes against her beliefs, and two, that it's a veiled excuse. But the proof is in the employees that have been fired, and more men than women have been fired under this policy. And I think that is going to, as wild as it is, that's going to lean in the favor of Ramsey being able to say, no, this was a proper termination, even though the result is something that most of us look at and go, wait a second, you're what? What's happening? I don't understand how that works.
So from this, I'm gathering there's a chance that that the lawsuit will not turn out in her favor, in which case I'm glad that we're just putting Dave on blast on the internet, because like even if this doesn't, like, even if he doesn't suffer consequences legally from that case, perhaps he can suffer consequences in the public sphere from people all knowing what an asshole he is.
And I think the broader, because when I look at my audience, and a lot of my audience is like, oh no, I liked his advice, and I like his kind of quippy way of being like, don't be an idiot, like this kind of tough lovey type, I'm going to give it to you straight kind of attitude. I don't think people realize how deeply rooted the company values are in his belief system. The thing that's weird to me is he doesn't align it to one particular ideology or one particular church. He's not saying we are Methodist, we are Baptist, we are this. It's like his own hodgepodge of beliefs that he has determined. It's like the Church of Dave with these rules.
I mean, that's the next thing we're going to talk about, is how it might be a cult. But yeah,
it feels very strange how the rules play out, but it's not associated with tenets. You know, if it's like, this is a Catholic workplace and we believe in these things, it's very much clearer to go, okay, well, I am also Catholic and I understand that these things are tenets of Catholicism. When you go to Christianity as a broader belief system, people express that in very, very different ways. And that's what's going to come up in this lawsuit too, is, well, it's not aligned with one particular ideology. So is it so vague that it's now this view of Christianity versus this other? And we're going to get courts that are supposed to not be involved in religion anyway, determining issues of religion. And it's very, very strange when religion and workplace blend together in not a church setting. It's easy if this is a Catholic school with a teacher who's gotten pregnant outside of marriage, and you can look at that and go, oh, okay, well, this is a Catholic school. You knew what the expectations were. You are the face of this school. That becomes an easier case. This is I think, a more gray zone case. But because those males have been fired, it's going to be harder for her to overcome the argument that we apply this policy to everyone. And she's going to have to argue this policy is inherently discriminatory. Because how do you even find out that dudes are having premarital sex unless they disclose that willfully?
Yeah. So I think the religion angle is really interesting, because when I was talking about this in the first video I made about Dave, and I mentioned that, most Christians I know would think that like their value would be focused on protecting a woman who's pregnant, because she's bringing a new life into this world, and a big part of Christianity seems to care about the new life and new babies and protecting people who need your help and things like that. So putting a pregnant woman out of a job and forcing her to raise a kid without income seems like the opposite of what I know is what people who are Christians believe. And a lot of people
out of a job,
in my
out
chat,
of medical care.
Out of medical care, out of all of that.
Yeah.
So everybody in the chat was basically like, yeah, I'm a Christian too, and I think the same way you do. I think that you would want to help out a woman who's pregnant and gonna have a new kid. You wouldn't want to put her out of a job, out of medical care, out of money, all of that. That's not what I see as Christianity. That's not what a lot of people do. But I guess it's how Dave sees Christianity. So that argument's going to be interesting too, because it almost seems like, even if you're arguing that this is a religion-based company, but it doesn't, like I guess this woman is saying, that doesn't really adhere to how a lot of people see this religion.
Absolutely. And that's in her third amended complaint. That's her argument, that her sincerely held beliefs of Christianity don't comport to no premarital sex, where when you have a religion that makes it much more clear, and I default back to Catholicism because I was raised Catholic, they make it very clear that premarital sex is on the no-fly list. But it's same with other religions, but Christianity as a broad theological concept has a lot of different interpretations, and tolerance is kind of central to it. So she's arguing that her views of Christianity allow for this, and she doesn't understand, even though she knows it's frowned upon, doesn't understand why she's been terminated, and thinks it's because she's pregnant, not just because she had premarital sex, and that's discriminating against her for her religious beliefs.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And I'm on Dave's side of this, like when he laid out the righteous living policy and all of that, did it specifically state like no premarital sex or no pregnancy outside of marriage? So it didn't state that. So
No.
I guess you could argue that just because he says this is a Christian company, that does not automatically translate to that. And as an employee, she wasn't really, even if she knew that like culturally at the company it was frowned upon, like she said in the email, that doesn't mean that she knew she would be fired for it.
And it'll be interesting to see if it comes out that she was aware that others had been fired for this, or if she just knew it was frowned upon. Like, I know this is going to be a challenge. I know this is not looked upon well. This might hinder future promotions or what have you. I think when she told her employer, she was probably very nervous about what they were going to do. Whether she knew they had terminated others for premarital sex will be interesting to see in the discovery. But the core values under righteous living say we believe that character matters all the time. Okay.
I mean, that's pretty vague. Yeah, any company could say that and not have it really mean anything.
Character does matter. Great.
Yeah, everybody agrees on that.
Yeah, don't be a dick. It's truly, it's not hard. So there's going to be an argument for Dave that it doesn't all need to be spelled out because it was culturally known within the company. And we're going to see those arguments from them as this goes forward. I think they're going to try to work towards resolving it. In most lawsuits like this, it benefits both parties to resolve them, but we're now at a third amended complaint. This can go on for years is the problem for the plaintiff, because Ramsey Solutions is going to pay for all of this. She is the one who's having to bear the cost of her lawsuit. And if she loses, she does not retain or get back her attorney's fees. So this can be tremendously stressful and tremendously overwhelming. And they are going to go after everything. Yesterday there was a new filing that they are now subpoenaing her partner to try to get all of his communications with her, and her partner's objecting to the subpoena, saying, no, you're not going to get all of our communications.
Like every email or phone call or
email, text messages.
That's creepy, dude.
They want to see if she was distressed, because she says this is causing stress, or if she knew that she was going to be terminated for this. So they're trying to get to the heart of those communications. Unfortunately, under the law, those things would normally be protected by spousal privilege. But because they are not married, spousal privilege doesn't extend to that relationship, even though they are in a long-term committed relationship. So the thing that would have stopped her from getting fired might have also prevented some of these discovery issues. But people have the right to choose to not get married.
Exactly.
And I don't love that the norm is, well, if you're not married, you don't get these protections. It's going to be a long one. It was just filed. I mean, we're coming up on just a year. It was filed in July 2020. So these cases can take years to resolve. We're still at the beginning of this, where they're still filing motions to dismiss and amended complaints and starting discovery. At some point, there will be depositions. After there's depositions where they sit down, all the attorneys in a room. Depositions are horribly stressful, but it's all the attorneys in the room with both sides sitting at a big table and asking questions of the person who's being deposed that day, which will end up being the plaintiff, HR for Ramsey Solutions, coworkers, and things like that. Those can often help resolve a suit, because it's like, okay, all the cards are on the table. Can we come to some kind of an agreement? And I know there's times that I've seen it in my coverage where people get very frustrated when suits are resolved. And I always say, look, the person who's suing, who's bearing the expense of this, has the right to pull the ripcord on this, because it can be very, very impactful financially and emotionally. So I try to give grace if people choose to resolve their cases behind the scenes, because not everybody has the money to fight these things out in court to the end.
However, if you guys remember from part 1 of this video, this particular lawsuit is not the only one that Dave Ramsey's dealing with right now. In part 1 of this particular Deep Dave series, we also reviewed another lawsuit that was filed from a male employee, where he talked about suing Ramsey Solutions for having cult-type atmosphere, cult-type tactics used in the company, and specifically he talked about surrounding COVID and COVID protections, and how Dave was forcing people to come into work in person and saying it showed a weakness of spirit if they didn't come in. We talked a little bit about that lawsuit as well, although that one seems a little bit less cut and dry than the one about pregnancy.
As I mentioned in the other video, Dave Ramsey's also dealing with a separate lawsuit from a male employee about the office having too much of a cult atmosphere. I know we mentioned earlier, Dave doesn't seem to really say this office goes by this church's beliefs or this church's beliefs. The office really goes by his beliefs, and he seems to be kind of the guy who's in control of everything, which sure, you can make the argument that it's his company and that's his right to do as he wants. But this guy was kind of saying, no, this was becoming too invasive in people's personal lives, too cult-like, especially around COVID, where Dave was not taking any precautions against that. He was making people come into work in person, even with confirmed COVID cases. And what did you think of that whole lawsuit and what's going on with that one?
It's fascinating. I haven't dived into it as deeply as this one yet. It is on my list, but I live in the same county that Ramsey Solutions is in Middle Tennessee. I drive by the Ramsey Solutions campus. There were times when there were mask mandates that he was violating the county mandates, which I think gives strength to the lawsuit saying, look, it's not as if we just didn't want to. These were violating what the local mandates were. And the local mandates in Tennessee, I moved in the middle of the pandemic, were not what they were in Southern California. But they were clear what the social distancing was, the amount of people that were gathering, and there were mask mandates in Williamson County up until the end of May. So I think that gives some strength because there's now, this policy was also violated. But it is a very interesting workplace culture, and how culture gets regulated by government is also something that's weird to me. It's like, where are those boundaries of what you're allowed to do in a workplace versus what becomes actually illegal? And the COVID aspect of it, I think, makes it able to bring a lawsuit because you actually have things that are public safety and individual safety issues coming up. In this, you can't get somebody from Hollis Company suing because they don't want to dance.
Right.
So you know the workplace culture, and you can't. But when it comes to COVID and it comes to safety and it comes to violating local regulations, then you actually have some teeth to bring that. And from the core values, I know I sent them to you. Some of those core values, I'm like, that's okay. Okay, we've got some very, very toxic positivity core values, I think, in this. So, the no gossip policy sounds great in theory, but then it's like all positives. It's like, well, so you can't bring complaints
too. So I remember his what I was reading in the coverage about this particular lawsuit was his allegations of cult type behavior at this company were a couple of things. I think the COVID one's probably the biggest, but beyond that, he talked about how there was no negativity allowed. There was a no gossip policy, which meant you were not allowed to ever talk bad about other people at the company. And because of that, it almost seem to go into that information control territory where you're not allowed to share negative experiences with anyone, so everything kind of got kept under the rug. And on top of that, he felt once again that Dave was trying to interfere in his personal life, where when he got hired, he immediately, his wife was pressured to start hanging out with other wives and spouses from the company, when it's like, well, my wife didn't join this company, I joined this company, so why are you trying to make my whole family be a part of this? And there were some things there too. Now, I don't know much about the law, obviously, so I don't know how much of that is more in a gray area related than when the COVID stuff came in, but all of that, it's one of those things where I'm like, it seems like a bad workplace environment. Whether it's legal, I don't know.
And that's the boundaries of legal kind of bump up along discriminatory, and the workplace rules are much more cut and dry with hours. It's not like, if I say something negative, I could be fired and then I'm completely cut off from all of my friends and my whole community. Feels very much like some religions I've talked about and you've talked about, where it's like if you're out, you're out. Exactly. If you're out, you're out, and no one's allowed to talk to you. So, but it's not been defined a cult by, the US government. It is not even a church, but then your whole community is wrapped up, and they're a large employer in this area. And if you move to this area to be a part of that, everyone would be part of Ramsey Solutions. The people you go to church with are likely part of Ramsey, the people you socialize with. So to get cut out of that would be a lot, and could make it very hard for people to want to leave. But the no gossip policy is interesting to me because the plaintiff in the pregnancy case, Caitlin O'Connor, talks about in one of her filings that her email was forwarded around for people to give comment on. And people were saying that, yes. So they were gossiping about her and her email, which is clearly in violation of the no gossip policy, maybe not illegal, but just showing that not all policies are applied equally across the board. And I was kind of surprised by that. I'm like, oh, others were saying that this is a classless email, that you know, she immediately needs to be terminated for her transgressions. And I thought it was very interesting that this email was getting forwarded around, not just from her supervisor to HR, but for others in the community and the company to give comment on, and then for the board of this company to give comment on. Like, her business became everyone's business, not just between her supervisor, and HR. And that's where I think some of the seeking damages for the embarrassment comes in, because it was not handled the way you would expect a more sensitive health matter to be handled in an employment situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot going on with that. And then I guess going into, you know, the suit regarding, you know, the cult type atmosphere, it seems like maybe the stuff that he said about Dave ignoring COVID might be the biggest stuff from what I'm hearing.
The stronger,
that might be
the easier
stuff.
stuff.
Yeah. Because I remember he was saying that Dave, like, he forced people to attend a 900 person in-person meeting with a confirmed case of COVID there, and told people that if they wanted to go from home, it meant they were like weak in spirit and they were required to attend in person.
Right.
I saw clips from Dave's radio show that I put in my previous video where he was talking about how he got really tired of people trying to force him to wear masks in a store, and it made him angry and upset. And like we said, Tennessee was having mask mandates, so
yep.
Dave was the one explicitly in the wrong here. So I don't know. How do you think the COVID safety stuff might play out in that case?
I think it's stronger than just saying that the workplace environment is like a hostile work environment because it's a cult-like atmosphere. Hostile work environment can be difficult to prove, especially if they've made clear what the work environment is when you're coming into it. And it seems that Ramsey goes through a pretty extensive hiring and onboarding process to indoctrinate you into the way it is going to be.
Yeah.
And so that, though it can seem creepy, it also is one of those things where you're like, oh, but you were aware going in what the workplace culture was like. So it's not really a hostile work environment. You're getting what you were told you were going to get. You just don't like it. Making the COVID stuff stronger, because I don't think anyone can anticipate your boss basically saying you have to come to work. Yes, somebody has COVID. Don't be soft about it. It's like, it's a global pandemic. That's not the answer. And there are actual mask mandates. So you're now asking people to break what the state has determined is the appropriate rules. And that, I think, has stronger teeth legally than trying to say a workplace you knew was a hostile work environment. It doesn't mean it can't be. It just means it's more of an uphill battle on that.
Well, I really appreciate you talking to me, going in depth about Dave and his lawsuits and kind of looking at that legal perspective with me on this, because it's definitely not my area of expertise. So I'm really grateful that I was able to have you on to tell me about that whole side of everything.
I'm so glad to have a chat. I love the way you break things down in your coverage.
Thank you.
I love the diving deep into the buttholes of butthole thinking. I love it so much. But I think it's a great way to break things down. And really, I love that you evaluate them, give credit where credit is due, and ask the questions to facilitate the conversations that need to be had, because there aren't easy answers. Even though we know the solutions we might like, there still aren't easy answers around this, and those are the important conversations to have. And I thank you you always facilitate that on your channel so well, and with so much integrity.
What do you guys think about these lawsuits? Please let me know in the comments below. I think this whole thing is just a mess, and it's really showing Dave's true colors, and I'm glad that we can get this information out there. For now, this is going to be the end of the Dave Ramsey Deep Dave series. However, if new developments come up in these lawsuits and new stuff comes out, I will absolutely be happy to cover it on this channel and to talk about that, because I really want to see what happens and if it does set a precedent for how much an employer can be involved in their employees' lives going forward and what is considered an acceptable barrier for work-life balance. We see how that can get really sticky in certain situations, especially when it comes to, you know, some people might be doing bad things outside of your company. They might be being awful people and you don't want to hire them even for things they did outside of work. Okay, but then where does that end? This is definitely not an easy black and white solution, or else I think we'd already have this figured out. So please let me know your thoughts or your nuanced takes in the comments below. I'd really like to hear your guys' opinions. I will see you all again on Monday for another video, but in the meantime, please don't forget to support small businesses and have a fantastic Friday. Bye everyone.
Get you some nuts.
There was lots of memes.
Makes me wonder if I should take up lesbianism.
Chicago.
You guys asked for it.